The Siege of Toma was a bloodless action during the First World War on the island of New Pomerania between 14 to 17 September 1914 as part of the occupation of German New Guinea by the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force. Australian forces had been dispatched to seize and destroy German wireless stations in the southwest Pacific because they were used by the German East Asian Cruiser Squadron of Vice Admiral Maximilian von Spee, which threatened merchant shipping in the region. New Zealand provided a similar force for the occupation of German Samoa. Ultimately, the German colonial government was forced to surrender after being surrounded, ending the last significant resistance in the territory. Prelude. The Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force reached Rabaul on the 11th of September, finding the port free of German forces. Small parties of naval reservists landed at Cabacol and Herbertshoe on Oipommern, southeast of Rabaul. These parties were reinforced firstly by sailors and later by infantry and proceeded inland to capture the radio station believed to be in operation at Beta Packer, 4.3 miles to the south. The Australians were resisted by a mixed force of German reservists and Melanesian native police, who forced them to fight the way to the objective. By nightfall the radio station was reached, and it was found to have been abandoned, the mast dropped but its instruments and machinery intact. During the fighting at Beta Packer, 7 Australians were killed and 5 wounded, while the defenders lost 1 German NCO and about 30 Melanesians killed, and 1 German and 10 Melanesians wounded. At nightfall on the 12th of September, the Ernanamp MEF Infantry Battalion was landed at Rabaul. The following afternoon, a ceremony was carried out to signal the British occupation of New Britain despite the fact that the German governor had not surrendered the territory. Siege. Meanwhile, after the defeat at Beta Packer on the 11th of September, the remaining German forces retreated 19 miles to Toma, believing they would have time to recuperate before the Australians arrived. Unknown to the Germans, however, an advanced party of 200 Australians had followed them from Beta Packer and surrounded the town, proceeding to bombard it with a 12-pound field piece. The protected cruiser HMAS Encounter also arrived on the scene, and fired several shells at a ridge nearby. The German governor Eduard Haber knew his small force would eventually have to surrender, but continued to hold out for several days, hoping that the German East Asia Squadron would arrive to relieve them. Nevertheless, the show of Australian firepower was sufficient to start negotiations, forcing Haber to realize that his hopes were futile. The Germans subsequently made favorable terms with the Australians, surrendering the colony and ending the siege. Terms were signed on the 17th of September and all military resistance ceased, with the remaining 40 German soldiers and 110 natives surrendering on the 21st of September. Haber was allowed to return to Germany, while German civilians could remain as long as they swore an oath of neutrality. Those who refused were transported to Australia, from where they could freely travel back to Germany. Aftermath. With the government's surrender, nearly all of German New Guinea came under Australian control. The majority of the Germans living there were interned and later deported. Only a few isolated bands of German forces continued to resist after the fall of Toma. By 1915, the only remaining German resistance in the colony besides the occasional merchant raider was Lieutenant Hermann Detzner and his band of 20 native police who evaded capture in the interior of New Guinea for the entire war. Following the capture of German possessions in the region, the Ernanamp MEF provided occupation forces for the duration of the war.